Hello, everybody. We are so excited to welcome you all to tonight's event, which is part of the Courtauld and Somerset House collaborative digital programme supported by Morgan Stanley. Tonight, we will be enjoying a conversation between two exceptional artists, Karl Ohiri and Mohini Chandra, both of whom are currently included in Unquiet Moments, Capturing the Everyday, an online exhibition recently launched by the Courtauld Institute of Art's MA Curating the Art Museum students. Unquiet Moments is an exhibition that really celebrates the recording of everyday life through the making of art. The exhibition spans 4 centuries, and it really looks to explore the enduring impulse felt by human beings to really reflect upon and document their daily lived experiences in many different ways. And right at the heart of the exhibition is the concept of the archive, what that might constitute and what kind of narratives and daily experiences might perhaps fall outside of that. And so photography and interventions into photographic practice really features centrally throughout the exhibition. And so Karl and Mohini's photographic installations have become really central artworks within the exhibition. When we kind of initially conceptualized the exhibition in the embankment galleries of Somerset House, we'd actually imagined Karl's How to Mend a Broken Heart and Mohini's album Pacifica to jointly occupy this kind of vast chapel-like space at the far end of the gallery as a kind of culminating point of the exhibition. But with the move online following the pandemic, the two works have actually been integrated into slightly separate sections, with album Pacifica relating to the everyday as expressed and experienced through kind of family albums and community portraits, and How to Mend a Broken Heart sitting very centrally within what might be considered the final section of the exhibition, considering loss and traces of loss. But having said that, we really feel that both works could have been placed in kind of many different ways in the exhibition, and that there's this really strong dialogue between Karl and Mohini's practices. And so we're really excited to have them both here this evening in conversation. My name is Annie, and I am one of the 9 curators responsible for Unquiet Moments, and I will be moderating the conversation this evening, though I must add that I am joined by my wonderful, for tonight, a little invisible classmate Zaina, who has organised the events programme accompanying the exhibition. I also encourage everybody watching to ask any questions that you might have throughout the event via the comments, however you're watching, and we'll try and integrate them into the event as we go along. And finally, maybe not now, maybe after the event, do make sure that you take a look at the exhibition online via unquietmoments.courtauld.ac.uk. So I just wanted first to introduce our 2 fantastic contributors before giving them both the opportunity to introduce themselves and their practices more broadly. So to start off, we have Karl Ohiri, who is a British-Nigerian artist working between London and Lagos. And Karl's practice is photographic, performative and archival, but also uses photography, video, text and everyday objects to kind of consider connections between personal experiences and broader societal structures. Ohiri pursues kind of 2 inseparable strands of human existence in his practice, that of the self and the other, the self relating to autobiographical narratives around his own family and identity, which has informed a body of work that really challenges the boundaries between the public and the private, and the other relating to wider societal observations on current affairs, collective histories and cultural heritage. Karl's works have been showcased internationally in venues and exhibitions that include the Venice Biennale, the Reatu Museum, South Bank Centre, the Courtauld Gallery, Tate Britain, and the National Portrait Gallery. Mohini Chandra is an artist of Fijian Indian heritage, currently based in Totnes in Devon, and Chandra's practice explores the international flows of people and culture in the context of globalization. Informed by her childhood experiences spent in Fiji and traveling the Asia-Pacific region, Chandra's work has explored the role of both photography as practice and performance, but also photographic material as it relates to memory, migration, and identity. identity. Mohini is Senior Lecturer in Photography at the Plymouth College of Art, and her work has been exhibited across the world, including the first Johannesburg Biennale and exhibitions at the Asia Society Museum in New York and the Whitechapel Gallery in London. And her work is held in international collections across the UK and the USA. So without further ado, I am delighted to invite Karl to take to the virtual stage.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Hi, my name's Karl Ohiri. I'm a British Nigerian artist, and I work primarily with photography, everyday objects, and occasionally sculpture. So what I'm going to do is, because my work has two strands, I'm going to mainly be focusing on the autobiographical elements of my practice and sharing some works that incorporate photography as a way of looking at memory, as a way of working with identity, and also as a way of preserving narratives that related to the self. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to, you just bear with me. Fantastic. So the work that I have in the exhibition is an autobiographical work called How to Mend a Broken Heart. And that work really focuses on how we can use objects to relate to everyday moments within our lives, and how we can also look at what the object does in terms of the texture of the photograph and the stories that are untold within the photograph as well. My work uses a lot of photography, and it always has been central to my practice. And the biggest work for me within the body of work that I've produced is a work that's called How to Mend a Broken Heart, which is one of them. And let me just get the other one. In My Mother's Clothes, which is another one. So just excuse me 1 second. So about that. So what I like to do is to just go over some of the works that I've been working for within my practice. The first one is a project called Memories of You. And what that work is about is, when I came into the family home after some time after my mother passed away, I realized that photography was a good tool for me to look at how I could explore an absence that she had. There was an absence of her after her death, and I wanted to kind of use that to reconnect with the memories of her. So what I decided to do is I started to work on a body of work which was going to see how I could replace that lost absence within the photo album. I had all of these images, and when I started to look at what made the presence of my mother so important to me, there was an absence within the album which I just couldn't replace. So therefore I decided to start to, knowing that the house was going to be sold, I started to get all of the albums together. I started to look through them, noticed what was missing, the everyday moments, her cooking, her getting ready, her going to bed, all of these wonderful moments that weren't there. I started to recreate those moments through photography. And because she wasn't there, I started to use my body to take on the role of my mother. And in that work, it was really about questioning how we see photography and how we can kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of go beyond the surface to create these new narratives. And that was very important for me within the work. So knowing that the family home was going to be lost at some point, I frantically started to think about all these memories that were lost. And one of the biggest memories I have was my mum used to cook so much food and do all of these wonderful things with cooking. And it would really be something that I would miss about her after she passed away. So wearing her clothes and all of the things that she left behind, I started to see how I could use photography to bridge that, start to embody her, start to create these essentially new parts of the family album, and play with that as a way of memory, preserving memory, because I knew that once the house was gone and once, with my mum passed away, that I would never get these memories back. So photography was used to bridge the void of absence, so I could then keep her memory alive and keep working within that structure. This is another image called Nollywood Nights, and it's the same kind of premise here. She used to sleep with the TV on and watch loads and loads of Nollywood films at night. And within this photograph, there's also a picture of my mother and myself on the bedtime table. And within these stage photographs, I'm really asking the viewer to look at the idea of my recollection of my mother and how that could have been. Is that something that, how true is this recollection? For me, it's an unquestionable truth, but for the audience taking part of that, it's more about kind of seeing what the power of photography can do, how we can look at the photograph, read into it, and form our own narratives. Another image called Morning Cigarette, which was just about the beautiful light that used to flood through the living room and catch her while she was having her morning cigarette. And this is a very important image for me, because it was one of the things, although it was something that I never appreciated of her doing with her smoking and stuff, but it was something that was a memory that just encapsulates her. So it was something that I wanted to make sure was inside the body of work. So within my practice, I use photography as tools to look at memory and to preserve memory. But also within my practice, I also look at objects and the recontextualization of objects. And my practice has gone on a very wide range of different trajectories. And one of the biggest bodies of work within my practice is a collaborative piece I did with a friend of mine called Saeed Hassan, a very good friend of mine. I hope he's watching. And we used our objects of our grandfather's cars to look at how we could revisit our history. So using sculpture, using everyday objects as to how we can revisit and reconnect with our ancestral past and bring them to our present lives here in the UK as migrants. So we really wanted to create a work that was about what it means to be British. And as migration was a big part of our histories and our heritages, we decided to, once we did the work, to put a big installation within Heathrow Terminal 5 of the work, which would be something which was very site specific, because it would allow the people that were viewing the work to be able to pass through the space, think about the objects that they were leaving behind as they would travel to different parts of the world. You know, it was something that they could relate to, the millions of people that passed through Heathrow. There was also some video works that encapsulated the experience for us. And it was always, the end goal of the project was to bring the two works together. And for many of the people that don't know the work, that didn't happen. But still within the sculpture, it's always about how we can realize works in different ways. I'm interested in how we can realize works in different ways, because a lot of the work I do isn't about things happening perfectly. A lot of my practice is about working with circumstances and responding to circumstances. And although we couldn't bring the cars in part one together, it was still about creating this big, massive sculptural form in the middle of Heathrow and parking them together to make a commentary on what it means to be British, you know, today, what it means to kind of have to leave objects behind, what it means to take a story that is very personal and how that intertwines collectively, and what new narratives come out of that as an experience, and how that could then interconnect with other people's stories, because our grandfather's cars are a part of our everyday lives. My granddad was from Nigeria, Saeed from Pakistan. We were both at that time in the UK. So it was about how do these stories interconnect with each other. So it's a very beautiful work that I'm very, very proud of, which has got a lot of, that's had a good reception and a big part of the practice. This is another just image of us talking about called Centerpiece, which is about the car that ended up being shrunk to this almost kind of into a tiny little sculpture because it couldn't be, it was held at port, and then because they couldn't let it go through port, they had to crush it on site when I went back to collect the car. And this project was about how we would have conversations, and also how important conversations play within creating those dialogues of work. Through conversation, we learned a lot about each other's histories, and that's a big part of the practice for me, learning about other cultures, seeing how we can open up dialogues, and seeing how we can then start to create projects out of that. And the sculptural form within my practice is something that has been, again, it's a circumstantial journey. And it really started a lot with the My Granddad's Car project. After we couldn't get the car over, we decided to, how could we resolve this through photography? How could we start to make a record and document? And that's why photography becomes so crucial for me, because it's about the documentation process as well. It's about a proof that we were here, we did this, you know, this happened. And part of the project about bringing the cars together was to, I took a piece from my grandfather's car, Saeed took a piece from his grandfather's car, and we put them in a furnace, and we melted them in a foundry in Sheffield, and we created this hybrid object, which was a testament to the various different types of metals and different types of configurations of peoples and their objects around the world. That does ultimately end up creating this one object. So it was a steel ring that we decided to do. And that's another thing that forms part of the exhibition and another part of my sculptural works. And within the practice, there's a quote that I was looking at when I went through the site, because there's so many fantastic works. And there was a quote from, if I can find it now, a quote from Vanley Burke, which he states that he said he loves collecting things that have been discarded and drawing value out of them. And that's a really, well, it's something that really struck me within his work and also within my own work, because that's something that I really love to do. I love to look at the discarded objects, look at discarded photographs, and then start to build a narrative from that as a starting point. It's done within works that are in the beginning of the exhibition, family archive work. It's done within My Granddad's Car, and it's also done within a newest body of work that I've been working on, which is the Lagos Studio Archives project, which looks at discarded negatives from Lagos, Nigeria, that were discarded from a generation of photographers who were abandoning their archives due to a shift to digital. So they were taking photos in the 70s, 80s, digital came along, and they were just like, we don't need these physical negatives anymore. We're just going to discard them. And it was something that really struck deeply to me for someone who likes to preserve things. And as I said, like just to draw value out of something that doesn't, that might be discarded by others. So I started a project where I would start to collect a lot of this photography and see if I could preserve as much of it as I can, and then put it back into the world, the visual space, because there was a lack of representation from Nigerian vernacular photography. So I wanted to fill that void. And, you know, like some of these images are just, it really just pains me to feel that these would have been lost images, because the dress, it says so much about us as a society and how people live in the everyday. So it would have been a complete tragedy. And there's so many of this photography that's getting discarded. It's something that I really wanted to preserve. So there's another couple of images here. And that's the last image, really. So it's a little bit waffly, and I do apologize for that. But the thing is, the crux of the situation is that photography plays a huge part of my practice. And it's something that without that, I wouldn't be able to tackle a lot of the complex issues that I have without being able to use the tool of photography and just use that as a way of working backwards through history and coming to a new vision of how I think that photography should be used.
Thank you so much, Karl. It was so great to hear from you, and also so cruel of us to give you so little time to introduce like a vast practice. So
I was, what can I say? You know,
you gave us a great overview.
It was tight. It was tight.
No, that was great. And I'm sure we'll pick up on lots of these things in the conversation, certainly the Lagos Studio Archive, because they're just such incredible images.
Sure.
But Mohini, would you like to take over on the presentation front and tell us a little bit about your practice?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, great to see you. And thanks so much to everybody for organising the show, to Annie and the whole team, and also to Karl. How do I follow that? Amazing talk. Yeah, so just to introduce myself, my name's Mohini Chandra, and I'm an artist who has lived partly in the UK, partly in Australia, and moved around the Pacific. And I suppose part of my cultural background is from the Fiji Indian diaspora. So I'll be talking a little bit about the background there. And very much like Karl, I'm very interested in photography, its relationship to the archive and to memory, and as a vernacular form of a lived expression of history. You know, history isn't this monolithic thing. It's made up of many narratives. And it's, you know, how do we tease out those kind of diverse voices? And I think I found myself at times working almost like an anthropologist and like an artist, and kind of in a very hybrid practice. And I've also worked across, my background really is in photography, and coming out of the sort of discourses around the critique of photography and documentary. But I've moved very much through different practices like moving image, installation, sculpture, appropriated objects, and so on. So it's become quite a diverse practice. And talking about Album Pacifica is wonderful for me. I mean, the whole experience of this show has been getting out from the Arts Council collection the work that I remember from so many years ago, and I've had so many wonderful conversations over the years with people about this work, and it was just so lovely to see it again on film, and to, you know, look at that work. And in a way, so much of my practice over the years has come out of this incredibly fertile period, I think, in my life. I was just moving from being a student towards being an emerging artist, and doing postgraduate study, and this work came out along with a whole range of other works really investigating photography and the family album at this time. So for my talk today, I'm going to really just concentrate on that little period of my life when Album Pacifica emerged amongst some other works. And I'll just very briefly at the end touch on what I'm doing now. But as we haven't got much time, I'm going to go straight to screen sharing. So let's see if this works. Great, can everyone see that? That's all good. Great, okay. So that's just my little intro slide. So very much like Karl, actually, I mean, there's so much overlap between our work. For many years, I've been investigating photographic studios in Fiji, in the Pacific. And Fiji has a large population. At one point, it was almost 50% of Indian people from India, who originally came over in the late 1800s as indentured labourers to work in the sugar industry. So this was a kind of almost a form of slavery. It sort of replaced slavery, and indenture was a system that was very much used in the British Empire. And it was one way in which this country could say that it did not use slavery, but in fact we had indenture. And it wasn't only Fiji, it was other parts of the world as well. But anyway, so Indians came originally in this indenture system, and then they came later in other sort of forms of migration. And as they moved away from this sort of plantation life and farming life, many Indians moved to the towns in Fiji and set up photographic studios. And I was really fascinated at how a community would kind of make images of itself, in a sense, a kind of performance of its own identity, moving from a sort of enslaved population to one which had more freedom, but which was always seen as being somehow outside to the core Fijian identity, a notion of Fijianness, which didn't include this migrant labour force. So in some ways, Indians were quite invisible within that. But within their own photography, because they started to own as family businesses these photographic studios, they started to be able to express themselves. And what I found when I managed to go back there as an adult, because I'd been as a child and then I hadn't been back for a long time, and I went back for my work. I was very curious about this photographic history, and I started exploring the studios that were still there at the time. And it is, again, one of these sad losses of a history, in that many of these studios have now closed. There's still a few open, but again, a lot of the analog material, a lot of negatives and photographs are being thrown away. For many years, I've had a longing to do a preservation project. I'm really fascinated to hear about what Karl's been doing, because it strikes me as incredibly sad that this whole history, not only of the Indian community, but everybody, every ethnic group within Fijian society was photographed, came through these studios. And I'm just showing you here, this slide is of a backdrop. So in the kind of 40s and 50s, the backdrops would have been hand-painted backdrops, very much inspired by Bollywood, also inspired, you see alpine scenes like this and real kind of fantasy scenes. And in this image, we see a sort of photographic version, like a wallpaper of a backdrop. I just love the way this studio had a door going somewhere, some storage area probably, but it's a door to wherever, it's a bit like the Truman Show. There's an escape hatch somewhere. And the Indian community were always wanting to escape somewhere. India was this imaginary homeland that it was really difficult to get back to. As an indentured labourer, you had to work your 5-year gurmat or agreement, your indenture. Then you had another 5 years to earn your passage back, by which a lot of the connection with India, the place that you come, had been lost. And so the generations that followed that always imagined India as a homeland, but were unable to go there. And so you found all these little clues and all of these little links to India in this place in the Pacific, which is so interesting. And of course, family photographs for me, just the content of them, what's in them, the people that are in them, people that I recognized, and they're much younger in these photographs, but also what's happened to the photograph physically, the damage that has happened over the years, the scratches, the tears. Like this photograph is only, sort of half there, but it still tells so much. And I started to become very aware of the three-dimensionality of the photograph as a print, that it can be turned over, you can look at the back, you can look at the sides, and there's so much going on in it. And on its surface and within the materials that make up a photograph. So just to briefly explain, I've done quite a lot of research into the photographic history in Fiji. And during the colonial period, what I found was that the indigenous Fijian population were photographed much more than the Indian population as the sort of labour force in the plantations. There were some images of them, but there were many more of these kinds of images showing the so-called cannibal tribesmen being converted by the missionaries, being feminized, the lighter skin, the image on the right, the flower in his hair, and he's wearing the Sulu or traditional skirt. So he's much less warrior-like. And so and these images have permeated through popular culture. They were in the books like sort of The Living Races of Mankind, Victorian encyclopedias of the time. But they also now appear on T-shirts and mugs and in the museum, and they're part of the kind of national identity in a sense. But as I said, Indians were relatively invisible, except where they were exoticized in some way. And so I did find some collections, and interestingly, this was in one of the photographic studios. It's actually an archive of kind of late sort of photography from the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this kind of invisibility and exotification I contrasted with images that I found originally in my own family albums. When I started this project, people from my father's family were sending photographs to me from the albums. But then when I was able to go to Fiji, and also within the wider Indian diaspora, I was able to collect many more photographs, and really, was given negatives and images from the studios. So I should just explain what happened was, as Indians always felt that Fiji was a somewhat hostile and difficult environment, many of them in later generations, like my father's generation, started to migrate to other places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and America. So there's kind of a double diaspora, once to Fiji and then on and beyond. And it's a very complicated migration. So in a sense, I found that these photographs, I felt they were mapping. It was a way of mapping that journey and that complicated notion of your identity, which is constantly fluid and it's always changing, and you're always performing some sense of that identity. It's very partial, it's never complete. So in this one, my uncle is almost pointing to the beach, like, this is where I belong. And at the same time, the space of Fiji itself was so contested that he didn't really belong fully. He could never really belong to this. But within the studio, and this is a painted backdrop here that's still there in one of the Prasad Brothers studios. You could have a fantasy of your own identity. You could construct it any way that you wanted to. So I started making work in response to this research, which was just starting at this time. Long time ago. And in this piece, I made a video where I was just looking through an album, and you just constantly get caught in the first page. You never go beyond that. And so I was forming, almost by accident, an archive of family photographs, both from my own immediate parents and family and the wider family. And I'm showing you these images because they're part of my research, but they also very much influence the making of album Pacifica. And this is a tiny little image that just fits into the palm of your hand. And you can see here that the people, there's two figures, two women, and they're almost faded away completely. And I just loved what had happened to this image and how it was such a map of time and space and geography and everything all sort of coming together in one image. And so I started responding to that by fading images with toner and just bleach, and kind of just trying to find out whether the image, it's just hovering between being visible and invisible. Is it fading away, or am I trying to bring something forward? But this research was very, very much influenced album Pacifica. When I went to visit relatives who were living, family members who were living in different parts of the world, and this is in Vancouver, and my cousin was actually going to paint this room. So she photographed all the photographs in this particular arrangement because she wanted to be able to put them back exactly where they were. So I was fascinated by the way that families actually archived their own collections and curated them and presented them in very specific ways. And what I found, walking into these houses in Canada, and I'm like, okay, I'm here to see family photo. I want to see you as well, but I want to see your family photographs. And I walk into the house and they're just everywhere, all over the walls, going around the doorways, around corners. You follow them right through, and in the final bedroom there would be the big family portrait, which I did a lot of work about, the only photograph of my father and all of his brothers, 12 brothers and sisters, and his parents. So everything was just so interesting. My uncle drew me this map of the family, sort of family tree of where everybody was, which country they're in now, trying to trace it back to India. And there's a point at which we cannot go any further. We don't know, exactly where the ancestors before my great-grandparents came from. And the people with the lines through their names is because they've actually passed away. So he was quite had a lot of information. It was quite matter of fact about the way that he was presenting the story to me in a way. And then, of course, I started looking at the photographs that I was getting from everybody, and I was like, just trying to find out what was going on the back, I was noticing these photographers' stamps and thinking I really want to investigate these studios, and noticed that there were a lot of really interesting inscriptions on them, and that the surface of the image, what was going on the back was really interesting. So I just started photographing that to record it. And I just had one of those moments, those sort of light bulb moments where you go, oh, right, actually, that's really interesting. And so then it became Album Pacifica. I just kept going. I kept photographing these photographs on the back. And in the first installation, which was the Blue Coat Gallery, I showed 100 of these images arranged very much like the way that I had seen them in homes. So I was echoing that kind of informal arrangement, but which is very precise, it's very specific. Somebody has invested time into thinking about whether all the wedding photographs go together, all the graduation photographs, you know. But what was really lovely was as I showed this work in different places, and that one, it sort of went over a doorway and round a corner. Then it showed at the Shoreditch Biennale a year later. And it was, again, it was different because the space was different. So I thought this was really quite interesting that it could adapt to the space in which it was shown, rather like if you moved house and you arranged your photographs differently. And this is the one that we're showing at the moment for the Courtauld. And very kindly, the Arts Council Collection allowed the team to reinstall the work, which was amazing, and these guys actually filmed it, so what a feat that was. And it's just so lovely to see, and lovely to see how it's been interpreted by the curating team and hung, and I really love the way that they've done it. It's really beautiful, and yeah, on one single wall, you know, you get a different impression again. That's just a close-up of the work. Through this. It was also published as a book by Autograph, which I have here as well. I think there's still a few copies left. And so for this, I thought, well, I had an opportunity to make a book. It was commissioned, so I'd return them to a kind of family album and arrange them in a particular way that you might see them in a more intimate way within an album. So I gathered these together, and it's very, very early use of scanning technology to make this book. So that was just like a different way of kind of investigating it. And then I went on to make this work, Imaginary Edens, photos of my father. So, you know, after having made the photographs sort of disappear almost, it was like, well, what can I do next? And I'd been photographing backdrops in Fiji and looking at a lot of pictures of my father. And I worked over many years with my father. It was almost a collaboration, really. And I started sort of removing his image, because he was the one who left Fiji, and then he migrated to Australia, then he came over to the UK, and it was like he was the one who migrated so many times and always felt a bit of an outsider. And I think in the migrant imagination, it's like your head is always in at least two spaces at once. You're kind of in one place, but you're dreaming about another place, thinking about somewhere else. It's always running through your head. Maybe worry about your family, or, you know, thinking about the place that you've come from. And there's also a sense in which you've disappeared from that place. You are no longer there. You are absent to your family. So I've got one of my father, for example, in his bedroom back in Fiji, and he's removed from the image. So yeah, and at the same sort of time, I made this work, Travels in a New World, #2. And this is where I really started using moving image. That one with the album that I showed you earlier as well. It's a very sort of simple video piece. And I was shooting in Super 8 and transferring everything to video, and then the video was projected. I mean, the people coming out of, you know, studying now, you know, media and photography and moving image won't believe the trouble that we went to kind of get our work, you know, sort of projected or as an installation. And at the time, I really wanted to kind of think about breaking photography out of the frame and kind of making installations, making very immersive spaces that people could walk into. And in this piece, my father and all of his brothers and sisters in different parts of the world are all talking about one family photograph that they all remember. So it's different ways that you can investigate the photograph as a starting point, trying to work out what it means to people. And I also went back again, another trip to Fiji, and I started filming in the studios as people were having their portraits taken in a contemporary sense. And what I really loved about these films were actually the moments when nobody was there, and it was like a pregnant pause waiting for people to come in. And you can just kind of hear the radio in the background playing Bollywood music. And so there was this sense of performance that I saw in the photographs from the archive. I could actually see it unfolding in real time, right in front of me. And obviously the white background there being used because somebody needs a passport photograph taken. So you've got to kind of hide the interesting, more exotic background behind them. And just my last slide, I just wanted to mention that coming out of all of those works, you know, I've been making work constantly since then. So there's a big chunk in the middle that I'm not showing you. For example, I went back to Fiji and I took photographs in my father's childhood home, which is now empty. And I was really fascinated by this sense of loss and longing, and that could never be anymore, could never be reconstructed. And, you know, to sort of photograph the bench where my grandmother had been cooking in the kitchen, you know, it was just so amazing, and listening to the sounds outside that she must have heard. And I think that was something that Karl also touched on, this sense of loss that you feel. So I've done a lot of work, you know, carried on that way, but just very recently I've started making work about slavery and indenture more broadly. And because I'm based in Plymouth, I'm working in Plymouth, and I live just nearby in Totnes. I was really interested in Plymouth as a space in which it was, you know, one of the major naval ports, major maritime hub. So all the ships going out for indenture, slavery, all of those kind of routes, all the trade routes, as well as the Navy, would have come through Plymouth. So, and there are hundreds, literally, possibly 600 or so shipwrecks in the harbour in Plymouth Sound. And many of them have not been investigated. And the piece of water that you see there is actually above a slave ship, which is yet to be properly explored. And I'm working with an archaeology team on this project. So the work has it's gone from, I suppose, moved from family to a more collaborative and expanded practice, but I still continue to work around the sort of Fiji-India nexus in a way. But yeah, I think I'll stop screen sharing now. And I've probably gone way over time, but I apologise. But that gives you a kind of overview. Yeah.
No, likewise. That was, you know, such an incredible introduction to your practice. And I think it was kind of inevitable that we were going to be talking a bit longer in this beginning section, but I think everybody's probably bursting to ask lots of questions. But before we do, Mohini, we've kind of heard a bit about album Pacifica there, which was great to be able to kind of situate that in the exhibition. But I just want to invite Karl, you just to talk maybe a little bit about How to Mend a Broken Heart, just so that we can, yeah, kind of situate the two works that are both in the exhibition together.
Sure. Like How to Mend a Broken Heart is part of autobiographical works that fit into a body of work called Sweet Mother. And it was, Mohini talked about the accidental kind of making of work. And How to Mend a Broken Heart really started off like that. It was never really meant to be a work. As I said before, a lot of my practice is based on circumstances, and I never really went out to make work or be an artist and stuff like that. It was just something that kind of happened. And How to Mend a Broken Heart is one of those works that was just another part of that puzzle. You know, it was a piece of the puzzle that brought me to this kind of stage. And what How to Mend a Broken Heart is it starts from the family album, and there's it's 21 defaced family photographs and one wedding photograph. And it kind of documents, on the one hand, you've got a recording of these where my mum and friends would use photography. I think we're going to get some slides up. That's of the installation. Would use photography to capture these really amazing moments in their lives, these celebratory moments, getting married, an embrace, you know, trying to express happiness through photography within that split second. But then there was a moment within that where you have a recording of time, and then behind the image, there's obviously a lot of things that are going, untold stories, and a lot of things that are behind the image. And as her marriage started to break down, she then started to revisit these images and start to deface them, writing words like monkey on them, just trying to erase her ex-husband out of her life, out of memories. So it was about creating memories and then just frantically trying to erase them and make sense of life, make sense of what was happening, make sense of the journey that she was embarking on. And we were part of a family which we never really spoke much about like pain or things like that within like many families that are people that are watching. Maybe they've got families in that that operate that kind of way. And it was really, I used to kind of go through the family album and look at these photos, and we just would kind of like go flick through the photos, but then kind of pause and not really say anything. We would never speak about this hurt. But in many ways, and even to this day, even after she passed, we never really, the narratives that are within these photographs are for people to draw out their own conclusions to. But also myself, I'm still looking at these photographs and really wondering what did actually happen, and what was that. But what we do know from looking at the photographs is that there was a great pain that happened within that. There was someone that was searching to reconcile a loss. And I think that that's the beauty within the work. It's a work that after kind of going through the album and seeing these things, I would somehow try and persuade my mum and say, look, I want to do something with these because I find them so fascinating. And she was like, oh, she didn't really like say much to that. But I think that as I started to develop the Sweet Mother project, which was about looking at my mother's life and her, just what she went through as a migrant, stories of migration there, stories of love, stories of lust, stories of regret, so many things that kind of are teased out of, I don't know, I keep forgetting it all the time. The Sweet Mother project, which is one of my biggest works. I don't know why I keep forgetting that. The Sweet Mother project, it kind of, it just accidentally just slipped into a body of work that what I was building when I was investigating my own autobiographical world and hers as well. They were just kind of merged together and found themselves into a body of work known as How to Mend a Broken Heart, which is a reappropriated, recontextualized work, which kind of takes something very personal and puts it back out and shares it with the viewer, the audience, and asks them to make their own interpretations on the work. And another point, while I'm just while I remember, I also never realized why she didn't just throw the photos away. When someone goes through so much pain like that, you kind of expect them to just, the easiest way to erase the image is just to, rather than go through that rigmarole of trying to scratch out, is to maybe just throw them away. But there was something that interested me within the work, which was about, as much as it was about trying to let go, it was also about trying to preserve things. And for me, the only thing I can think of is maybe it was about memory and about maybe not wanting to forget the pain and always having a record of that. So she could always go back to the photograph and just remember of that moment. I wish they were kept in a box and she could do that in her own, but as a family, they were all part of our thing, and it did create some awkward moments. But I think that it was one of the moments for me where I could really look at the power of photography and look at the surface of the photography, which Mohini was describing, and really start to think about time and space within photography, how we can sometimes make an image, but what's of happiness but what's going on around the sides. No one knows what's happening around the sides. I was doing this talk, and around the sides there was lots of paperwork, which caused me to frantically fumble around for the first part of the conversation, but no one can really see those things around the sides. And I think that's a little bit like How to Mend a Broken Heart. There's a lot of things that went on around the sides, but we're fortunate enough to get a glimpse into some of that through the etchings and the defacing of the photograph. It's a work that I just thought that had to be made into a work, had to be part of I couldn't tell an autobiographical story about my mother without including the work, although it is powerful and it does, the lines between the public and the private are definitely blurred on this one. I'm a strong believer that we have to share these type of stories in order to grow, in order to learn about the human experience. And there's nothing in that suggests a weakness for me. We love, we lose things, we lose people, we get hurt, and we respond to those things. And that's no different to what was happening within the work.
I find it so interesting, Carl, because it sounds like in a way you worked quite closely with your mother, and I worked really closely with my father.
That's correct, yeah.
They don't quite, with my father, and he was so happy that I was interested in the family history, you know. And after being a rebellious teenager and not wanting to know, I was like, oh yeah, tell me everything. And it's like, what?
Yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah, and it was awful to lose him. You know, a couple of years ago he passed away, and it was just, oh, it was like such a huge loss for so many reasons. You know, it makes it quite difficult to talk about your work in some ways, doesn't it?
It does, but when you lost your father, was there untold, is there still bits of, was there things that were untold? There must have been loads, but are there still things that to this day you're still kind of grappling with and trying to make sense of?
I think you always feel that, and I always felt he'd be there, and I could keep going back and asking him more questions, you know,
sure.
Unearth some other photograph that I hadn't seen, or, you know, and I could share a Bollywood film with him that I was just exploring. He'd say, oh, I saw that, you know, when I was a kid, and stuff like that. So there are those moments that there's a different understanding that your parent has, because they're really invested in the memory of it, whereas other people you talk to about it are more involved with it as an artwork, and it's quite a different conversation, isn't it? But I think, you know, what you're saying about the scratching on the face and the marks and the erasure of the identity is really interesting, because I think that's something that I've investigated a couple of times in my work. And for me, showing only the back of the photograph and not the front, or removing my father's face from the photograph and putting something else there, was trying to create a space in which other people can share in the work, because it becomes symbolic of a photograph of a particular situation. So no matter what background you're from, whether you're from a kind of interestingly diverse kind of global background, or if you know, you don't feel you are, you still have wedding photographs, you still have, you know, certain kinds of images. And if there's a clue on the back of the photograph or in what's remaining in that image, then in a sense the audience can, you know, I think people can invest in thinking about their own lives within that image. So for me, when I saw your images, you know, with a lot of faces kind of almost scratched out, it had that kind of resonance as well, you know. And I think the mark making is so violent in some of them. It's
yeah, but
you almost feel that anger and that pain, don't you?
No, of course it has that.
Yeah, the materiality of what has happened. And I think that's something amazing about the photographic print, and I'm not quite sure what's going to happen now that everything's sort of so digital.
Well, that is the question. I think it's about, because at least if you revisit the photograph, for example, like within How to Mend a Broken Heart, it's is that physicality of the photograph, where you can go back and like your own work within the Pacifica project, you can go and you can see that there can be another intervention that can be made within the physical photograph. Whereas with things moving to digital, it's very difficult for that to take place.
Yeah.
Within How to Mend a Broken Heart, there was things that were very much replicating the digital sense. Okay, fair enough. There was no, you couldn't go back and with a digital photograph as such as it's shared and make these etchings. But for me, it was about the in-between spaces of when and truth was it when a photograph is made. Meaning that if you look at kind of things on like Instagram or Facebook, for example, and they're posted and that's the image. But then if you think about the stuff that happens on the outsides, you know, like so many things, as I said before, could happen, you know, on the outsides of the borders of things. And I think that that's the beauty of that's the difference really between the digital, because it kind of, you have to take it for face value and you don't see other sides to it a lot of the time, because it just kind of exists in quite a flat profile. Whereas with the physical object, you've always got this sense of it being able to move in a different way, that kind of texture. Like with your works, we've got these etchings of, you know, like the studio stamps and all these other things. And this form part of a narrative. It's something that you pick up and you can pass on and you can read and you can look into, and it's just a very important part of the photograph.
Yeah, it is, and like so many things that are part of vernacular or everyday photography, it's something that was, I think, quite forgotten in photographic history or writing about photography. And I think I think artists have investigated this, and because of the interest in the personal and telling these kind of diverse stories from your particular perspective, you know, expressing your own narrative in a way. It's so interesting now that we take this kind of photography quite more seriously, I think. And yeah, it's positive.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think what you were saying before, I lost my train of thought. I think what you were saying before about
join the club.
Yeah, all the things around photography, you know, so that's why
Yeah.
I was so fascinated by what happened the moment before a photograph was taken, you know, when people were setting up in a studio, or the photographer's stamps, the culture that grows around a photography, the idea that in these family-run businesses, the guys are out there taking the pictures, and apparently the women were in their back painting, colouring them in and stuff like that, you know. And so there's this whole kind of enterprise that you don't really see, you know.
Sure.
So it's just so interesting in a way.
But that is the truth, you know. I think it just makes you really just wonder about the truth of photography. Obviously, with photography representing something quite wholesome and truthful, but the element of time being so crucial to that kind of perception. It's a split second to make a photograph, and as I said, it's kind of almost like with the digital now, with things like social media, you create that image, and it's like within just a fraction of a turn, so many different kind of things are going on. As I said, with the wedding photos within How to Mend the Broken Heart, so much happiness is captured in there, so much so much love, but there would have been, at the time of the making of those photographs, there would have been some troubles. You know, troubles would have been there, but they're not present in the photograph. And I think that's a very interesting thing to always remember about photography. Just, you know, we should always approach photography with an element of caution, really, because we don't really, there's a lot that goes into making an image. And a lot of people see an image as such a flat object, but in fact, it's more multi-layered and complex than we could ever imagine, and that we ever give it justice. So it's an interesting medium.
Yeah, it's like looking at those very early, you know, sort of Victorian era photographs of, say, indigenous Fijian people. They're all dressed up. It's a studio construct. So commercial studio photographers who would have done people's portraits have got a whole bunch of costumes and props and are creating something which then goes into a museum archive and becomes the truth.
Yeah, precisely.
It becomes what we know about these people, this group of people, and it's just so crazy. And so, you know, then I was just so fascinated by the playful way in which later on, you know, people get hold of this technology and actually quite blatantly are constructing a fantasy about their own identity. So I think in a couple of your images, you've got a child wearing a jacket that's too big, and then, then it's an even smaller child wearing the same jacket, which is even bigger. It made me laugh because, you know, I just love that kind of thing. It's sort of clues that undermine this sense of photography being a truth. You know, but I've seen props in photographs from the 1920s in Fiji, and I've gone back to the studio and seen exactly the same box that people were sitting on.
Exactly.
Because it don't throw anything away, you know, everything gets used. And I was like, just wow, you know, it's amazing. And just something else I want to pick up on this sort of idea of trauma that comes through as well, to be sort of more serious for a moment. I mean, there are inscriptions on the back of some of the works in Pacifica that say died in New Zealand, or, you know, somebody that never made it home and to their family, and just really sad stories. And there's one really beautiful one where there are three sisters in this photograph, and on the back, and one of them is written nice, nice, ugly. And she's written ugly on the back of herself, and she's actually, you know, really lovely. And it was just, just so sad, this anxiety or insecurity that that a young woman must have had to write that on the back of a photograph. It's kind of a joke, it's kind of tongue in cheek, but you know.
But there's some real truths. Yeah, of course. There's some truths that are highlighted through the act of doing something like that. I think that's really what kind of within the studio work that you investigate and the studio work that I've been, which is kind of like a new strand to my work with the Lagos Studio Archives project. I think that they're definitely two meeting points about the idea of the truth and the representation of the self, which are very important elements to kind of discuss. You were talking about how people would dress in these Fijian studios in their like best and project kind of these fantasy-based projections of the self against maybe a reality that was completely different. And it was the same within that can be found within the Lagos Studio Archives as well, because you would have people dressing up in their best attire. You would have people, doing all of these, just trying to present themselves in the best way. Yeah, we can just, for example, if we can take a look at the, there's an image, if you just flick through, there's an image of a man in a suit. This would be a man on the banister, and it's kind of the way that we like to, photography gives us an opportunity to present ourselves, put our best foot forward. How many times do you kind of like take a photo on your, I don't take that many photos, but I'm sure loads of people take photos, and we all delete so many photos that aren't maybe the best, that don't put us in the best light. And that's about the element of caution I was talking about with photography, because even there's always just that around the sides. It's like, this guy would have gone in, he's wearing his suit, but then he may not have two coins to rub together. But the space of the performance of the studio and the aspirations and the, just the performative element to it, and the fact that you can then be who you want to be in this space. And it's for the viewer to pick out like the truths. And sometimes there's little giveaways within the photography that kind of let you know that maybe that's all is not right, or something like that. And that's really what I like about the studio photography setup. And that's where I think that both of our practices kind of cross paths there, with that fascination of the representation of the self versus, the truth of the photograph. And I really, really like that. So I'd love to see more of those studio works that you've done, so we can kind of compare and contrast,
Well, I'm fascinated to know how, or if you plan to like preserve these kinds of images. Are you going to digitize them, or are you just planning to keep the negatives? And
it's a complex project. It's a very, very complex project in terms of like what will happen to the archive. I think the fundamental aspect for me was to make sure that these images were saved, because you were also talking about maybe that photography is appreciated, but there was elements where some of it was getting discarded and things like that. And for me, the project at this kind of early stage is really just making sure the archives don't get destroyed, because it's not really rocket science to work out that once they're gone, and I'm sure that most of those aren't scanned, that will be it, and big history will be lost. And I can't save all of the archive and save all of this history like single-handedly, but I've been able to just save some parts, and I think that that's really important. So it's the process is really just save what I can, have conversations, start to kind of work on a dialogue, and then we can see what happens after. There's all sorts of really issues of copyright, issues of lots of issues that arise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so interested in this because it's something that has occurred to me so many times every time I go to Fiji, that it's such a terrible loss. Every time I go back, more has been lost, more studios closed. Sure. And as artists, it's hard for us to have the resources to become archivists and museum collectors, sure, and sort of just preserve all this stuff, But I have the feeling it's potentially a global project, because I think this is happening all over the world.
Yes, I think so. Definitely. I would say it's because when I speak to people, like, a lot of people think maybe this is just something that's happening in Africa and things like that. But I think it's happening. I think it's about the way we educate ourselves about the image, essentially. And in the UK, of course, archives are being lost, but not in the same way. Like when I would go to do this project within Nigeria, within Lagos specifically, when I'm taking these archives and I'm trying to save these archives, I literally have people laughing at me. What are you doing? They just think that I'm crazy. So there is this element of value and understanding that I think needs to also kind of be addressed. More of an understanding as to the cultural value of the photograph.
Yeah.
Because as you said, all over the world that's happening. And I think that there's going to be a time within like 20 years where we start to look back. It's the time, it links with the digital, because it's probably a time from about the 80s. And, that's the time where the digital came in and people just jumped 4 megapixels, I'm on it, and all of those negs were like just not really valuable anymore. And then it's the physical neg that then takes up space, and then there's heating, there's all sorts of other kind of problems then that arise. But ultimately it just ends in the negatives being at risk and this culture being at risk. And it's a problem. So
yeah, it is. Were there any other questions?
This has been so fascinating. I feel like I've just been sat here like absorbing you guys.
Nice.
So thank you for just bouncing off each other so much. I mean, on that note of this kind of, I'm so glad we've spoken at length about the studio archives, but kind of looking at what the impulse for conservation and preservation that you both evidently feel so strongly, kind of to what end, in a way. Mohini, I know that you've spoken about this sense of visibility that you want to somehow, I don't know, generate through reassessing these studio archives. And Karl, I know that you've talked about a slight conflict as to whether to send this material back to Lagos, correct me if I'm wrong, or whether it should stay in where you are here.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct.
So I'd just be interested to know kind of where this deep impulse for preservation is really coming from for these studio images.
I mean, I think for me, it's really about realizing that as most of the Indian Fijian community did not have their own cameras up until about the 1970s or even 80s, the studio was the only place in which you could really have a photograph made. So going along to the studio several times a year, for Diwali, Christmas, New Year, and obviously for passport photographs was a really important ritual. And it was that centrality, and also the fact that not very much in the way of other forms of visual culture came across from India. So this was one way, probably the primary way that people actually were expressing their own history, or that history was recorded. And it's been kind of largely invisible. And I was amazed that when I first went, so many studio photographers kept so many negatives, even from people who are no longer around. Because you would think that a studio photographer would only keep a negative if someone's going to come in and ask for another print. But somehow they had, masses and masses of stuff. But as an older generation, sort of retired, or people migrated and went away, there was a sort of rush to get rid of stuff. And I just could see that happening within a very short space of time, within a few years. And I think because it is such a unique history of the everyday, but also a record of kind of migration and a community gradually becoming more cosmopolitan, more multicultural, however you like to think about it. It was kind of a mirror of, I guess, some elements of globalization happening within a microcosm. And I think Fiji was a very interesting microcosm of colonial conflict and post-colonial, the ramifications of colonialism, a sort of virtual state of apartheid between people that had been imposed, that then, echoed down through generations. And I think that photography for me sort of told that story so well. And I think as artists, perhaps we also see this as a really rich resource. And it's sort of a bit unbearable that people don't value it somehow,
Of
you know.
course.
But you've got to remember that you're looking at economies where there's people, you know, they're struggling to support their communities in terms of basic things like healthcare and so on. So, you know, we can go over and say, oh, we're horrified that you're not preserving all this, but the museum has no budget. The National Archives has no budget. And what you need are actual local field workers to go out and talk to people and gather material. And really, we can't, you know, from our privileged position, go in and kind of almost impose a kind of value system, much as, you know, that's frustrating. Yeah, sorry.
I think that what you're picking up there is something that I've definitely experienced, the idea of the structures that could help in this resolving some of these issues within like Lagos, within like Nigeria, a wider context of Nigeria. It's very, very problematic to try and do anything. You know, it's not a priority for many people saving these archives. As you said, people have to get up in the morning very, very early, you know, work incredibly hard. This kind of discourse, this kind of like romantic kind of, you know, semi, you know, intellectual kind of poetic kind of response to these things isn't really something that they're interested in. They've got to feed their kids, they've got to, you know, the healthcare and a lot of things. It all ties in, essentially. All has a knock-on effect to how we perceive value. And some very damp, humid, moldy negatives are pretty low on someone's list of importance. And I'm not saying it's right, but it's when you start to open up an understanding of that, you start to realize why things are the way they are. And in Lagos, I say Lagos, but I also refer to parts of Nigeria, and just Nigerian, some parts, I think hopefully people watching won't be too cheesed when I say this, but there is, we don't really have the support structures from the government. It's, you know, if there was a place where these could be housed, I'm sure some people would say, well, it's not my problem, you know, I don't mind, I can just put them there. But there isn't that system there for that. So it's not even a consideration. So if the government don't care about preserving these things, then why would it be the everyday man who already struggles and is running his own kind of life, where the government aren't involved in that anyway? So there's lots of knock-on effects to that. But I choose to preserve the archive because I'm Nigerian and I know its importance. And I wouldn't want to see that archive vanish, you know, aspects of that archive completely vanish from the, when I tried to look at books of Nigerian studio photography, there's like 1 or 2 books. There isn't, the representation is really lacking. And we need to broaden that representation through, you know, through our rich cultural history, you know, what people wear, you know, the fashion, the culture. So many things can be teased out of that by just preserving these archives. The way that we see our relationship with the UK, the European gaze versus the, you know, West African gaze, the inclusion of different cultures and commodities, and what they, and the globalization, elements of globalization, and we can learn so much. So I have this impulse to preserve these things because although in Lagos, and they may look at me as, you know, just some crazy person creating, just picking up lots of moldy negs, I know that they have a value, and we'll be able to use them at some point, and people will be incredibly satisfied and appreciative when that time comes.
Definitely. I'm just going to start bringing in some questions from the audience, even though we have tons to get through. So somebody called James on YouTube has said, thank you for the fascinating discussion, and has said that there seems to be a sense in these photos of both an encounter with presence, that at the same time, they also mark a loss, and is wondering what your thoughts might be on this and how this might relate to material traces on the photographs themselves, in terms of the handwritten text, or, you know, the I guess the disintegration in some way of the surface.
Yeah, I think absence is perhaps how I would put it. It is about loss, but it's also about absence, that if you move, you've gone away, you're not there, you're absent, you know. And absence is something that is so much part of photography, you know. In order to have something present in front of the camera, it philosophically, you know, it has to be absent at some point, it has to be gone. And you know, I've always really enjoyed reading Roland Barthes and his sort of take on this idea of absence and loss within photography. And I think that's kind of very influential. And I think perhaps it's quite pertinent to think about that idea of absence and diaspora and what that means photographically, because I think in every photograph there's something of that element that's there. You know, in Karl's images where they've been partly erased, I think I can sense that as well, and it's something that's definitely there, and it's different to loss, because I think absence, just there's an expectation of a presence and of something material, which could be an image, which could be a thought, which could be somebody who could be there, and they're not, you know. So there's, what are the factors that have made that absence happen? And if you can almost photograph that empty space, you get that sense of people moving through time and space and going somewhere else and not being in your life anymore. So if it makes sense, it's conceptual and it's emotional at the same time.
I'm not going to expand on that because you've just put it exactly how I would have saw it. So I think we can move on to the next question, if there is any more.
I'm going to give you one of the questions that I was hoping to ask as well.
Sure.
And I'm going to kind of bring two together. One being asking you about, I mean, Mohini, you've spoken about this a little bit already, but in terms of the installation of your works, you know, your practice is actually quite different to a lot of the other photographic work in the exhibitions, in that both of them are quite vast installations. And Mohini, it was such a pleasure to be able to work as a group of young curators with you on putting this hang together, and how it has these very many different iterations every time it's shown. And you spoke really beautifully about the kind of domestic roots of that in these diaspora homes. And Karl, it would be interesting to hear about your perception of installation and the importance of that, because How to Mend a Broken Heart is 22 works, and that's how it's appearing in our exhibition. But the physical work is actually on show just as 9 images at the moment. Am I right in thinking?
At the Newland Art Gallery? Yeah, that's correct. It's 9 images that are on show there, physical works, until COVID-19 just put a lid on everything. So yeah.
But is there an importance to how the works are hung for you and the kind of approach to installation?
I'll quickly chip in, and then I think Mohini will really take this because her work is 100 images, so I'm sure that she's got lots to say about that. But for me, for me, it's I don't really, the hang isn't so important for me. When the work went into collections, I was very specific to make, you know, they ask you like, how would you like the work to be hanged? Then you go through all of this kind of documentation and stuff. And I was always quite keen to make sure that the work was able to be quite organic. I thought that the message behind the images was more important than the artistic, for me at least, because with the photographs being defaced and then the wedding picture, I didn't want it to be a case of like, well, you have to have the full 21, because even if you're just looking at the one image, I feel that you can really get a sense of that sense of loss and that sense of love. When you get the full 22 images, of course, it's a much more powerful piece, I feel, because you really get a sense of repetition, and you get a sense of the feeling, and you get a sense of this is something that's gone over time, and you can see different babies there, and then then there's it all kind of ties together in a much, the narrative ties together in a much more empowering kind of way for the viewer to kind of observe. but I was really wanted to just keep that open. And then if I'm being brutally honest, I also think that there was a sense that would that kind of stop the work being shown, you know, still kind of coming through as an emerging artist and things like that. If I just if I'm Chris Ophelia and I say, well, look, this is my work, then it's like, oh, well, there's 22 images, you know, that's it, or 100 images or whatever, that's kind of fine. But I was also a bit kind of, there was a tiny element that was kind of saying to myself, well, maybe if I just keep it simple, you know, maybe if it doesn't have to be so, like it has to be the full 22, then I can make sure that the work, if there's just a little bit of space, that the work can then be seen, whether it's 3 images or it won't create, the installation will not hinder the message. And that was why I chose that approach, to not really have that as a factor to the hang.
Interesting. I think, oh gosh, casting my mind back to that time, I'd been studying photography for my undergraduate degree at Farnham, which was a renowned photography course. We were taught by Martin Parr, Anna Fox, wonderful people, but also people like Keith Arnott and Peter Kennard, and quite conceptual artists as well. And but a lot of students were working in quite a documentary way, colour, flash, documentary, series of images on the wall, beautifully framed, that kind of thing. And I suppose in a way, when I started making my work, and I couldn't get to Fiji immediately, I couldn't really work in that documentary way. And I had to look at archives and I had to look at images. And I also started looking at a whole range of kind of installation artists at the time, Bernard Toom, people like that. And I love that use of space and the use of object and things like sound, you know, really exciting for me. And I felt that the stories that I was trying to tell was so complex, even for me, that how could I get that across in a single image? So the student work that I graduated with was sort of boxes with sound coming out and a photograph that I'd blown up really huge and kind of separated. So it was all kind of fragmented and on the floor, and the viewer had to kind of walk through this space, and there was a soundtrack that said, "Where do you come from?" Because I was also at the time going on these sort of anti-racism marches, and I was getting really tired of people asking me, "Where are you from?" because I looked kind of different, you know. I mean, it's unbelievable that we're still going through these debates now, so many years later. It just keeps going around in circles. But anyway, so I was all fired up about that. And one of my students was complaining about how they went to London, and there was one of the students that I was with, one of my colleagues, was saying that they went to London and they were so appalled to hear all these different people speaking in different languages on the bus. Oh, you know? Anyway, so that really fired me up. So as a response, as a student, I made this very explosive kind of work, but it was based on my family archive. And so there was a gentleness. I think there was a gentleness about it as well. And so moving on from that, you know, I'd started to really get the photograph almost off the wall and kind of in a more expansive installation way, to tell complex stories, to engage the viewer in a slightly different way. And I suppose the album Pacifica kind of came out of that. It was a return to the frame, it was a return to the photograph or the back of the photograph, but by flipping it, I hoped that I was, I don't know, doing something surprising for the viewer and kind of making them consider the space in and around a photograph. And be conscious of how it's made and how it's been used. Was it kept in somebody's pocket? Was it in their wallet? Was it in their suitcase? Was it in an album? Was it torn out? That story of migration then hopefully comes across more strongly. Whereas you could look at, you know, photographs from studios in India or Fiji or Nigeria and say, well, they're actually quite humorous, you know, there's something about them, but they're still exotic, they're still interesting to me because it's some other culture that I don't know about. And I wanted the viewer to go beyond that sense of exotification and engage with the photographic nature of this object and what it was, and this photographic history, and to feel somehow some empathy with that experience rather than seeing it as something other that happens somewhere else, far, far away.
There's 100 images in that body of work. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I only ever made one version of that installation because it was all, you wouldn't believe it, pre-digital. It was all kind of bleached by hand, and to get the edges really white and this image really sticking out. And I used wax around the edge to stop it. I didn't know what I was doing. Luckily, I had a darkroom at home at that time, and I was just experimenting madly. And it was such a labor. You know, I made those things in this hot darkroom at night, and it took days and weeks and weeks. So I said, I'm not making any more of that. I just made one version of that work, 100 images, and then very luckily the Arts Council bought it.
Was the use of 100 images, was there any kind of symbolic meaning behind the 100 images? Did it have a, or was it just that you felt that 100 images would be best represent the work that you were trying to show?
It just felt like a good solid number, and I think by that point I just had to stop. You know, I mean, it was so frustrating later on when I found other images that had great backs on, and I'm still discovering them.
Yeah, that's a, and while we're on that note about the way that the work was made with the backs, because within that work you photographed, you rephotographed the backs of those, and I just wanted to ask whether or not, like, how why the originals. Well, was there a chance? Was there an opportunity to use the originals?
Yeah, I could have done that. I had the originals,
and maybe why you objected against that and decided not to do that. Just
I don't know. I mean, I think I'd been looking at Victor Bergen's piece. You know, where he photographs the floor and then he puts the photograph on the floor, and it's like, it's because it's a photograph that the work becomes quite interesting, because it's a photograph of something that's real. It's one step removed.
Sure.
And then you have a photographic moment when you made the image of the image.
Sure.
So there's a whole. I think for me the work was richer and more complex if it was photographed. Again, the actual object would have been like a museum and like an archive, like an original, a beautiful object, but it might not have had that level of step back of criticality that I wanted. Sure. Another work that I did, the one where my father is talking is a big blue projection, and with all of his brothers and sisters were all talking in the same room. It's like all your relatives come around at the same time. But they're all talking about one photograph that they all remember. And I filmed that photograph. So it's a still photograph, but it's actually filmed as a moving image piece and just projected on the wall. So it's like I was to reinterpret photography, I had to re-photograph it or refilm it rather than show the original.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm going to have to dive in because we're almost at the end of our time, but there is one more question from the audience that I was hoping to ask you as well, just about what you're both working on at the moment and what might be emerging in your practice over the coming months or years. And just to finish on that note.
Karl, you better go.
Well, I'll still be, I've got this light that's all just gone all funny on me, but anyway, I'll try to not lose my train of thought. I'll be working on the Lagos Studio Archives project. I'll be doing that for, the foreseeable future. So that's going to take up quite a lot of my time. And then around that, I'll just be working on small pieces. I'll be using photography and other mediums to just make small pieces in and around, my practice. I have a family, little daughter. So, I use that opportunity to make smaller works at the moment. As I said, that my practice is always based on circumstances. So now that she's in my life, I'll be doing the big project, which is Lagos Studio Archives, but then I'll also be having little interactions with things and still just trying to keep active and make as much work and as possible and share work with people and things like that. So that's pretty much me for the next couple of years, I should imagine. And yourself?
Well, I think my last slide was the Paradise Lost project that I'm working on in Plymouth. So I'm looking at the shipwrecks basically in Plymouth and what they tell us about colonial histories and migrations. And I see this as a precursor to contemporary globalization. The sort of relationships that were set up then within the British Empire are the ones largely that we live with today in terms of our own kind of network and relationships as a country. And I was very concerned when I came back from Australia last time about the kind of whole Brexit thing, the kind of growing, what seemed to be a growing xenophobia. And I thought, you know, actually, it was kind of really interesting to think about the roots of those kinds of discourses. Where it's always been my search, where does that come from? And to me, it all seems to go back to this power relationship, this hierarchy and these cultural stereotypes that were formed at a very particular time. So there's that. So that's quite a big project. It's quite a collaborative project, and I'm still working on the Fiji, India stuff, and I've been photographing in both places, and I'm hoping to do something where you don't know quite which place you're in. So,
Nice.
so that strand that comes out of looking at the family, the personal, that will always be there in my work. But there are other commissions and kind of interesting projects that I'm finding being down here in Devon quite interesting. It's sort of quintessentially English, I suppose, in a way, but it's really, really beautiful, and I'm really enjoying some of the aspects, you know, interesting here. For example, Tagore spent time here, so there's always something interesting and unexpected to investigate wherever you are. And wherever I go to a place, I sort of try and tease out, you know, how can we decolonize the debate around this place, you know? So yeah, just carry on really. But I'm really enjoying working in moving image at the moment, and sound and photography as well. So yeah, there's more to come.
So much, but of course also facing the same challenges of helping your students move on to a digital platform like us.
yeah, I teach as well, which is great fun, but you know, it's very absorbing activity.
Definitely.
But yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. It's been, I joked with you saying I hope that I'm not needed and that you can just chat together, and it's been absolutely wonderful to hear you both speaking. So yeah, I can't thank you enough for having your works in the exhibition. They've both been so central, and I kind of implore all of our viewers to go and look at them in the context of the exhibition, and to watch the Arts Council film that we had made of Mohini's work. It really illuminates it in a lovely way on unquietmoments.courtauld.ac.uk. And other than that, thank you so much. And hopefully this is the first conversation of many.
Yeah, let's hope so. Fantastic.
Yes, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here.